Picture this: a single sequence of notes, hidden away for centuries, suddenly re-emerging with the power to unravel the very fabric of medieval society. This wasn't just any musical scale. It was a melody whispered to be touched by the divine, a sacred arrangement so potent that its rediscovery sent shockwaves through monasteries and royal courts alike. Monks clutched their prayer books tighter, scholars debated in hushed tones, and authorities scrambled to contain the unrest. Why? Because this wasn't merely about music. It was about control, about faith, about who had the right to speak for heaven itself. The story begins in the shadowed corridors of medieval Europe, where music wasn't just art, it was a language of the soul, a bridge between earth and the divine. Gregorian chants echoed through stone halls, their harmonies carefully crafted to elevate worship. But among these sanctioned sounds, there was once another scale, one that defied the rigid rules of the church. It was mysterious, haunting, and some claimed dangerously enchanting. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, erased from records, scrubbed from memory, as if it had never existed. Until it resurfaced, what followed was chaos. Imagine the scene. A lone musician plays the forbidden scale, and suddenly, the air itself seems charged with something unnameable. Listeners weep, others fall into trances, and rumors spread like wildfire. Was this the voice of angels, or something far more unsettling? Monasteries split over its meaning, royal academies denounced it as heresy, and the very people who once sought to suppress it found themselves powerless against its pull. This is the tale of how a handful of notes could threaten empires of the mind and spirit. By the time we're done, you'll never hear medieval music the same way again. So lean in close, because history's most dangerous melody is about to play once more. The Harmonia Divina wasn't just another musical scale. It was whispered to be a fragment of heaven itself, transcribed by mortal hands. The earliest traces appear in 9th century manuscripts, tucked between the lines of Gregorian chants like a secret waiting to be sung. Monks who first used it swore the notes carried an uncanny power, as if the air trembled with something beyond human understanding. When sung in the echoing vaults of a monastery, the harmonies didn't just rise, they seemed to shimmer, bending the very light around them. Listeners described it as hearing the veil between earth and the divine grow thin. But its origins, that's where the mystery deepens. Some scholars point to the ancient Greeks, arguing the scale's unusual intervals mirror fragments of long-lost Pythagorean tuning, a system said to mirror the music of the cosmos. Others insist it was born in the scriptoriums of medieval Europe, a daring innovation by some anonymous monk who dared to rearrange the sacred rules of sound. There's even a fringe theory that it wasn't invented at all, but discovered a sonic artifact like a fossil of some older, purer form of worship. What's undeniable is its singularity. Unlike the rigid, stepwise melodies of traditional Gregorian chant, the Harmonia Divina leaped and twisted in ways that defied expectation. Its intervals, those spaces between notes, weren't just unusual, they felt alive. Singers reported the scale almost resisting them, as if the melody itself had a will, and perhaps that's why it vanished, because when something sounds too much like heaven, someone, somewhere, will always call it heresy. In the hushed cloisters of medieval monasteries, every note carried the weight of eternity. Monks didn't just sing, they sculpted sound into prayer, believing that perfect harmony could summon the presence of the divine. Gregorian chant was their foundation, a rigid system of melodies passed down through generations, each note meticulously placed like stones in a cathedral wall. But the Harmonia Divina, that was something else entirely, reserved for the holiest moments, Easter vigils, ordinations, the deathbed rites of saints. it was treated less like music and more like a sacred relic. To hear it was to stand at the threshold of heaven itself. The scale's power came from its strangeness. Where traditional chants moved in predictable steps, the Harmonia Divina soared and dipped like a falcon in flight. Its intervals, those gaps between notes, created harmonies that shimmered with an almost physical presence. Manuscripts describe monks weeping uncontrollably when it was sung, as if the melody had unlocked some hidden chamber of the soul. Some even claimed it could heal. A single phrase sung over a feverish child might break the grip of illness by sheer sonic force. Yet this reverence made its disappearance all more devastating. One day, the scale was there, copied into antiphonaries with gold leaf precision. The next scrubbed away as if the very parchment recoiled from its touch. Some blamed overzealous bishops, terrified of music that stirred emotions too fiercely. Others whispered of a darker possibility, that the scale hadn't been banned but silenced because it worked too well. Because when voices lifted those forbidden notes, something answered back. The loss left a void no ordinary chant could fill. Monasteries compensated by tightening their musical rules, insisting that true worship required discipline, not ecstasy. But the legend lingered. For centuries afterward, monks in remote abbeys would speak of a melody just beyond memory, a ghost scale waiting to be rediscovered. And when it finally resurfaced, that's when the real trouble began, because nothing shakes faith like proof that heaven once spoke, and someone tried to smother its voice. The vanishing of the Harmonia Divina remains one of history's most tantalizing musical mysteries. By the 12th century, scribes stopped copying it into new manuscripts, and older volumes containing the scale were quietly altered. Notes scraped away, pages rewritten, as if the melody had never existed. But this wasn't just a fading trend. Something far more deliberate was at work. Historians still debate whether it was simple evolution in musical taste or something far more sinister. After all, this was an era when the Church wielded immense power over every aspect of life, including the very sounds permitted in worship. One theory suggests the scale's intervals, those unsettling, otherworldly gaps between notes, simply fell out of fashion as choirs standardized their harmonies. But that explanation feels too neat. Why would something so revered, so embedded in sacred ritual, vanish without protest? Another camp points to whispers from the time accounts of monks who claimed the scale's harmonies could induce visions or worse, make listeners question the rigid order of their faith. Imagine a melody so potent it could unravel years of doctrine with a single phrase. That kind of power wouldn't just fade away, it would be erased. The absence of any official decree banning the Harmonia Divina only deepens the intrigue. If church authorities had openly condemned it, we'd expect at least one parchment, one chronicle to record their reasoning. Instead, we find only silence and the occasional scribbled margin note hinting at fear. One fragile manuscript from a Swiss monastery contains a telling line: "We no longer sing the forbidden progression, lest it open doors better left shut." Doors to what? The writer doesn't say, but the implication lingers. What's undeniable is how quickly the scale's memory was suppressed. Within a generation, younger monks had no knowledge of it, and those who remembered knew better than to speak up. Yet the legend never truly died. In hidden corners of Europe, the melody persisted, passed down in fragments, hummed in secret, waiting for the day someone would dare to sing it aloud again. And when that day came, the consequences would ripple far beyond monastery walls, because some sounds once heard refused to stay forgotten. By the 14th century, Europe stood on the precipice of a revolution, not of war or politics, but of knowledge. Royal academies and fledgling universities were scouring dusty archives, unearthing long-lost texts that had been buried for centuries. Among these rediscovered treasures was a fragile manuscript, its edges crumbling, its ink faded, but its contents electrifying. There, nestled between treatises on astronomy and medicine, lay the forgotten notation of the Harmonia Divina. To the scholars who found it, this wasn't just a musical scale. It was a key to a door everyone had assumed was sealed forever. The academies of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford erupted in debate. Some theorists hailed the scale as a revelation, a mathematical marvel that could unlock new dimensions of harmony. Others recoiled, calling it a corrupted remnant of pagan mysticism. The controversy wasn't just academic. Royal courts, eager to position themselves as centers of intellectual prestige, seized on the debate as a way to assert dominance. Imagine the scene, a king's hall filled with scholars, musicians, and clergymen, all arguing over a sequence of notes as if it held the fate of civilization itself. One faction insisted the scale's unusual intervals proved its divine origin, pointing to ancient Greek texts that described similar harmonies as the music of the spheres. Their opponents countered with withering logic. If this scale were truly heavenly, why had the Church erased it? What made this clash so explosive wasn't just the scale itself, but what it represented. Medieval Europe was a world where knowledge equaled power, and the rediscovery of lost wisdom threatened to upend the established order. The Harmonia Divina became a battleground between tradition and innovation, faith and reason. Even the Pope's advisors weighed in, warning that tampering with sacred music could unravel the very fabric of worship. Yet for every cautionary voice, there were others, bold composers and theorists, who saw in those forbidden notes a chance to reshape music itself. The academies, caught between curiosity and caution, did something unexpected. They tested it. In hushed chambers, away from prying eyes, musicians tentatively plucked out the scale on lutes or cautiously sang its intervals. The effect was immediate. Some listeners described a sensation like sunlight breaking through clouds. Others felt an inexplicable unease, as if the melody was pulling them toward something they couldn't name. The scale's power wasn't just theoretical, it was visceral. And that's when the real dilemma emerged, because once you've heard heaven's echo, how do you pretend it doesn't exist? The debate spilled beyond lecture halls into the streets. Minstrels, always hungry for novelty, began slipping fragments of the scale into their songs. Soon, taverns and market squares buzzed with melodies that felt both ancient and eerily new. Authorities responded with edicts and threats, but the genie couldn't be forced back into the bottle. The Harmonia Divina, once buried by silence, was now alive in the voices of the people, and that terrified the powers that be, because nothing is more dangerous than a truth that refuses to stay hidden, especially when it's set to music. The moment the first notes of the Harmonia Divina rang through the royal court, the air itself seemed to crackle with tension. The composer, a daring figure whose name history would later erase, had woven fragments of the forbidden scale into an otherwise conventional mass setting, hiding heresy in plain sight. As the choir's voices climbed those uncanny intervals, the effect was immediate. Nobles clutched their goblets tighter, bishops exchanged glances sharp enough to draw blood. One chronicler later wrote that the music didn't just fill the hall, it slithered between the tapestries, alive in a way no melody had been for centuries. Church officials were the first to react. A senior cardinal, his face flushed with fury, slammed his fist onto the armrest of his seat, bellowing that no man had the right to twist God's harmonies into devil's knots. The accusation wasn't just about aesthetics. This was an era when music was believed to mirror cosmic order, a divine architecture of sound. Any deviation wasn't merely innovation, it was rebellion against heaven itself. Within hours, scribes were drafting condemnations, labeling the scale unnatural and its performers vessels of discord. Yet for every voice raised in condemnation, another rose in fascination. Scholars huddled in corners, debating whether the scale's unsettling beauty proved its celestial origins. One theorist from the University of Paris boldly suggested its intervals matched ancient descriptions of the music of the spheres, the harmonic resonance of the planets themselves. Others countered that its power was purely mathematical, a quirk of acoustics that tricked the ear into hearing divinity. The debate spilled beyond music into the very nature of truth. If a melody could shake souls so profoundly, who got to decide whether it came from angels or demons? Meanwhile, the listeners, those ordinary courtiers and servants who'd merely come for an evening's entertainment, found themselves unwitting participants in an experiment. Some described the music as a physical force, lifting them as if their bones had turned to light. Others fled the hall, hands pressed to their ears, muttering about whispers that slithered behind the notes. A stable boy swore he'd seen shadows coil around the choir loft, though whether from terror or rapture he couldn't say. The performance's aftermath was swift and brutal. The composer vanished, some said into a monastery's penitent cell, others claimed to a shallow grave. The choir's director was defrocked, his life's work reduced to ashes. But the damage was done. Like a spark in dry tinder, the melody spread. Minstrels hummed it in taverns, nuns secretly penciled its notation into psalters. The scale had escaped its chains, and no amount of decrees could stuff it back into silence, because the truth was this: once a sound has been heard, it lives forever in the muscle of memory. And the Harmonia Divina, it was the kind of sound that refused to die quietly. The Church's response to the Harmonia Divina's resurgence wasn't just swift, it was seismic. When reports reached Rome of choirs singing those forbidden intervals, alarm bells rang through the Vatican's marble halls. A special tribunal of cardinals convened, their robes rustling like autumn leaves as they pored over musical manuscripts with the intensity of inquisitors examining evidence of witchcraft. What they heard in those unusual harmonies wasn't mere innovation, it was insurrection. One elderly bishop from Toledo claimed the scale's augmented fourth interval, that unsettling, spine-tingling leap between notes, was identical to chants used in long-suppressed Celtic Druid rites. Another insisted its descending minor thirds mimicked the very progression said to have brought down the walls of Jericho in Scripture, a sound too powerful for mortal lips to utter safely. Yet the Church's panic went deeper than superstition. Gregorian chant had been carefully crafted over centuries as a sonic embodiment of divine order, each pure, stepwise melody a musical ladder to heaven. The Harmonia Divina's wild intervals threatened that fragile architecture. When sung by trained choirs, its dissonances resolved in ways that made listeners gasp, as if the music was breathing on its own. Traditionalists warned this was the slippery slope. If choirs could bend the rules of sacred sound today, what might they challenge tomorrow? The very foundations of musical worship seemed at stake. In a dramatic move, the papal court drafted an edict that would have excommunicated any musician performing the scale. But here's where history took an unexpected turn. A faction of musically literate clerics, many trained in the new universities, pushed back. These scholar priests argued passionately that mathematics, not doctrine, should judge music's merits. One Benedictine monk with a talent for geometry even presented parchment diagrams proving the scale's intervals followed precise harmonic ratios found in nature. The debate grew so heated that accounts describe inkwells being overturned in fury during one consistory meeting. This wasn't just about notes on a page. The clash revealed a medieval world at a crossroads. On one side stood the old guard, for whom tradition was the bedrock of faith. Arrayed against them were the early voices of the Renaissance thinkers who believed truth could be discovered through reason and experimentation, even in sacred matters. The Harmonia Divina became their battleground precisely because music lived in both worlds. It was mathematical enough for scholars to analyze, yet spiritual enough to make monks weep. The final compromise was telling. Rather than an outright ban, the Church ordered the scale could only be studied, never performed, under strict supervision. Manuscripts containing its notation were locked in cathedral archives with warnings scrawled in their margins. For the eyes of masters only, but like all forbidden knowledge, these restrictions only fed its mystique. Young choirboys whispered about it in dormitories. Traveling minstrels incorporated disguised fragments into secular songs. And in remote monasteries, aging masters still taught the scale in secret, passing it down as one might preserve a candle flame against the coming dark. Because some truths, once heard, cannot be unheard no matter how hard authority tries to silence them. Royal courts across Europe became battlegrounds for the Harmonia Divina's soul, not with swords, but with patronage and prestige. In Burgundy, Duke Philip the Good hosted lavish musical evenings where composers were encouraged to weave fragments of the forbidden scale into their works, treating it as a daring badge of cultural sophistication. His court musicians experimented with its intervals, blending them into polyphonic masses that left guests whispering about the Duke's divine ear. Meanwhile, in Castile, King Alfonso issued an edict threatening to revoke the pensions of any minstrel caught playing the scale, calling it a serpent in the garden of sacred sound. The contrast couldn't have been starker, one ruler flaunting it as a jewel in his crown, another banning it as if it were poison. For composers, this divide was both opportunity and minefield. Imagine being a musician in that era. One day, you're showered with gold for a motet that hints at the Harmonia Divina's mystique. The next, you're fleeing a bishop's guards because the same piece was deemed a gateway to spiritual anarchy. The Flemish composer Guillaume Dufay famously walked this tightrope, crafting melodies that tease the scale's contours without fully committing, like a painter who daubs just enough gold leaf to suggest holiness without provoking outrage. Others weren't so lucky. Records from the English court mention a lutenist whose fingers were broken after he performed an unholy progression at a nobleman's banquet, a grim reminder that artistic daring came with real risks. The political stakes ran even deeper. In Italy, the Visconti family used the scale as a weapon in their rivalry with the Medicis, commissioning works that flaunted their tolerance for the music of the future. Their private chapel became a laboratory for sonic experimentation, where the scale's dissonances were framed as intellectual triumphs. Meanwhile, the Pope's allies in Naples burned instruments on the steps of their cathedral, declaring such innovations the devil's arithmetic. What began as a debate over notes had spiraled into a proxy war between progressive and conservative factions, between regional powers jockeying for influence, even between competing visions of what it meant to be modern. Yet amid the chaos, something remarkable happened. The very persecution meant to erase the scale only amplified its allure. Noblewomen smuggled sheet music in their sleeves. Court jesters encoded fragments into popular tunes. In Prague, a scribe was caught replacing traditional chant notations with the forbidden intervals, later confessing under torture that he'd done it for the beauty alone. That phrase, "for the beauty alone," haunts the history of this conflict, because in the end, no decree could extinguish what ears had already cherished. The Harmonia Divina survived not in spite of the backlash, but because of it. Every attempt to silence it only proved how deeply music could matter. not just to monks and scholars, but to kings, to artists, to anyone who'd ever felt shivers down their spine at the right sequence of notes. And so the battle lines hardened. By the 15th century, the scale's fate was no longer just a musical curiosity. It had become a litmus test for power itself. Rulers who embraced it were hailed as visionaries or damned as heretics, depending on who told the story. Composers learned to write in layers, burying the scale's essence beneath acceptable harmonies like treasure waiting to be dug up. And through it all, the melody endured, whispered in courtyards, hummed in kitchens, clinging to the edges of history. Because when sound becomes rebellion, even the mightiest throne can't stop it from echoing. The moment mathematicians laid their compasses and measuring strings against the Harmonia Divina, music ceased to be just an art. It became a provocation of physics itself. Scholars in Padua and Oxford hunched over parchment, mapping the scale's intervals with a precision medieval monks could never have imagined. What they discovered sent shockwaves through both chapel and laboratory. The scale's most jarring interval, that spine-tingling augmented fourth, measured exactly the square root of 2 divided by 1, a ratio that made harp strings vibrate in ways that defied the neat whole number harmonies of traditional chant. To acousticians, this wasn't just unusual, it was a mathematical mutiny. The debate split the scholarly world. Traditionalists clung to Ptolemy's ancient tuning systems, where every note fit neatly into cosmic proportions. But the Harmonia Divina's ratios were unruly, like a wild vine twisting through the tidy garden of medieval music theory. One Franciscan friar, famed for his work on cathedral acoustics, published a scathing treatise disproving the scale's intervals created beats, those eerie pulsations that occur when sound waves clash. To him, this was proof of imperfection. God's harmonies do not shudder like a frightened horse. Yet in Paris, a young scholar named Jacques Lefebvre made the opposite argument. Charting the scale's ratios against planetary orbits, he claimed they mirrored the exact distances between Venus and Mars evidence. He insisted that the melody was the heavens transcribed in sound. What made this clash revolutionary was its method. For the first time, music was being dissected not with prayer books, but with quadrants and logarithmic tables. When a German organ builder demonstrated that the scale's intervals produced overtones unseen in traditional chant, even skeptics paused. These weren't just abstract debates, they had tangible consequences. In Canterbury, craftsmen recalibrated pipe organs to accommodate the forbidden intervals, only to find the new tuning made traditional hymns sound eerily out of tune. The very infrastructure of sacred music was being called into question. Yet beneath the numbers lurked a deeper tension. The Harmonia Divina forced scholars to confront an uncomfortable truth. Nature's mathematics didn't always align with human ideals of perfection. Those jagged ratios that made theologians recoil were, in fact, abundant in the natural world, in the spacing of tree branches, the rhythm of heartbeats, even the orbital resonances of the planets. The scale's critics called it unnatural, but the evidence whispered otherwise. Perhaps it wasn't the melody that was flawed, but humanity's understanding of harmony itself. By the time the Renaissance dawned, the controversy had reshaped music forever. Composers like Josquin des Prez began experimenting with microtonal shifts, tiny pitch variations that echoed the Harmonia Divina's rebellious spirit. The old boundaries between science and art crumbled as lute makers consulted astronomers and choir masters studied geometry. And though the scale itself remained taboo in most churches, its legacy was undeniable. It had proven that sound could be both a prayer and a mathematical proof, a bridge between the divine and the measurable. In the end, the Harmonia Divina didn't just challenge medieval music, it revealed how thin the line really was between heresy and revelation. Beneath the surface of sanctioned music, the Harmonia Divina thrived like a secret language among composers who refused to let its magic die. They couldn't perform it openly, not with bishops burning manuscripts and royal censors prowling cathedral choirs, but creativity found a way. Like wine smugglers diluting forbidden vintages into common casks, musicians began weaving fragments of the scale into otherwise orthodox compositions. A passing dissonance here, an unexpected leap there, just enough to make attentive listeners freeze mid-prayer, sensing something ancient stirring beneath the familiar harmonies. Take the case of an anonymous scribe in 15th century Florence who copied a seemingly conventional hymn for the Medici chapel. On the surface, it matched every rule of sacred counterpoint. But hidden in the tenor line, buried under layers of safer intervals, was the Harmonia Divina's signature augmented fourth. Only those who knew the scale's contours would catch it, like a shadow flitting across a sunlit wall. The choir master, rumored to be part of this underground network, allegedly trained his singers to emphasize those notes with the faintest breath of vibrato, making the forbidden interval shimmer just long enough to unsettle or electrify those with ears to hear. This wasn't isolated rebellion. Across Europe, composers developed elaborate techniques to smuggle the scale into acceptability. Some used musica ficta, a practice where performers subtly altered notes during execution, allowing scribes to write legal melodies while singers discreetly bent them toward the forbidden. Others employed hocketing, splitting the scale's intervals between voices so no single singer bore the blame. A particularly cunning trick involved writing the Harmonia Divina's structure backward, knowing that when sung in retrograde, its essence remained intact while evading detection by authorities scanning for familiar patterns. The scale's survival relied on more than clever notation. It became a living tradition passed through whispered lessons in cloister gardens and midnight rehearsals in candlelit crypts. Young choir boys, too inexperienced to understand the risks, were taught its phrases as special exercises to strengthen their vocal range. Lutanists practiced it under the guise of tuning their instruments, claiming those eerie intervals were accidental. Even the church's own scholars played a double game, publicly condemning the scale while privately preserving its theory in coded treatises disguised as mathematical texts. What's astonishing isn't just the scale's persistence, but how it mutated. Far from being frozen in its original form, the Harmonia Divina evolved as it traveled. In Venetian gondolas, it absorbed the microtonal inflections of Byzantine traders' songs. Along the Rhine, minstrels blended it with local folk tunes, creating hybrid melodies that pulsed with the same uncanny energy. Each iteration kept the essence alive while making it harder for authorities to pin down, like chasing smoke with bare hands. The most enduring legacy, though, lies in the music we still hear today. When Monteverdi wrote his revolutionary madrigals with their daring dissonances, when Bach crafted chromatic fugues that seemed to bend the laws of harmony, they were standing on the shoulders of those medieval rebels who refused to let a single sequence of notes be erased. The Harmonia Divina never truly vanished. It simply went underground, resurfacing centuries later in the works of composers who'd never heard its name but felt its pull in their bones. Because forbidden knowledge has a way of outlasting those who try to bury it, especially when that knowledge sings. Whispers of the Harmonia Divina's curse slithered through Europe like a dissonant melody no one could shake. A troubadour in Provence collapsed mid-performance after daring to play the scale's most jarring interval, his lute strings snapping as if plucked by invisible hands. A Benedictine abbey in Normandy burned to the ground the very night its choir attempted the forbidden progression in secret, though skeptics noted the kitchen fires had been left unattended. Even though weather seemed to conspire, a sudden storm drowned out the first public rehearsal in Milan, lightning splitting the cathedral's spire as the choir reached the scale's climactic note. Coincidence perhaps, but in an age where every disaster was read as divine judgment, the pattern felt too stark to ignore. The stories shared eerie details. Victims often described a physical sensation before misfortune struck, a pressure in the ears, a metallic taste on the tongue, as if the air itself had turned to liquid mercury. One account from a Spanish monastery's ledger tells of a novice who copied the scale's notation by candlelight, only to wake with his hands stained black as though dipped in ink, despite no pigment being nearby. Physicians called it superstition. Musicians crossed themselves and played louder because the scale's alleged danger wasn't just about harm, it was about transgression. These tales reinforced a primal fear that some knowledge was never meant for mortal hands, and the Harmonia Divina sat precisely at that precipice. Yet for every cautionary tale, there were whispers of darker manipulation. When the Duke of Berry's court composer died of a sudden fever after defending the scale's use, courtiers noted his rival had recently dined with a bishop notorious for suppressing musical innovation. A convent in Brabant blamed the melody for a plague outbreak, though records show their well had been poisoned by a nearby noble seizing their lands. The scale became a convenient scapegoat for tragedies both natural and political, its reputation weaponized by those with agendas far removed from music. What's telling is who propagated the curse myths most fervently. Church authorities circulated accounts of the scale's dangers in pastoral letters, while royal censors embellished stories to justify banning secular performances. The narrative served power but also betrayed its fragility. After all, if a mere sequence of notes could threaten kingdoms and shake faith, how stable were those institutions to begin with? The Harmonia Divina's legend grew precisely because it exposed a truth no decree could silence, that beauty and terror often share the same harmonic root, and humanity has always been drawn to the precipice between them. By the Renaissance, the curse had taken on a life beyond the scale itself. Alchemists sought its intervals as the audible quintessence, believing the augmented fourth could unlock transformation. Astrologers mapped its ratios onto zodiac charts, convinced certain celestial alignments made performances safe or catastrophic. Even Shakespeare would later weave echoes of the myth into The Tempest, where Prospero's music holds power to unbind the spell of sleep. The curse had transcended music, becoming a metaphor for art's double-edged power, to uplift or unravel, to reveal heaven's grace or hell's chaos. And so the Harmonia Divina endured, not despite its cursed reputation, but because of it. Forbidden fruit tastes sweetest when seasoned with danger, and this melody offered both nectar and thorn. The musicians who risked its performance weren't just playing notes, they were touching the live wire between divine inspiration and human audacity. Every snapped string, every cracked voice, every storm that seemed to answer its call only proved what authorities feared most, that some sounds refuse to be tamed, and the ones that haunt us longest are those we've tried hardest to forget. The Harmonia Divina might have faded into legend, if not for a dogged musicologist named Dr. Elena Voss, who in 1923 pried open a long-sealed chest in the Benedictine Abbey of Melk. Beneath moth-eaten vestments, her fingers brushed against parchment so brittle it seemed ready to dissolve. There, nestled between treatises on angelic hierarchies, was a single sheet of notation titled Modus qui non esti, the mode that is not. The ink had faded to ghostly brown, but the intervals were unmistakable. The forbidden augmented fourth, the shuddering minor thirds, the very intervals monks had once risked their souls to sing. When Voss later played the transcription on a university clavichord, her assistant reportedly bolted from the room, claiming the strings had begun humming on their own after the final note faded. Early attempts to record the scale were fraught with strange mishaps. In 1938, a Berlin studio engineer captured a choir performing it for the first time in centuries, only to discover the wax cylinders had warped inexplicably, rendering the harmonies even more dissonant than intended. When the BBC aired a reconstructed version in 1952, switchboards lit up with listeners reporting everything from inexplicable weeping to radios that switched themselves off during playback. Scientists dismissed it as mass suggestion, but the pattern was unsettling enough that archivists began handling the scale's manuscripts with gloves, as if the notes themselves carried contagion. What fascinates modern scholars isn't just the scale's eerie reputation, it's the mathematical precision behind its supposed cursed effects. Acoustic analyzers reveal its intervals create rapid, beat frequencies that trigger the vestibular system, inducing dizziness or even mild trance states in some listeners. The very qualities that medieval clerics called demonic, neuroscientists now recognize as hyperstimulation of the brain's temporal lobe, the region associated with spiritual experiences. That augmented forth, it's the same interval Tibetan monks use in ritual chanting to alter consciousness. The Harmonia Divina wasn't breaking nature's rules, it was exploiting them in ways medieval minds couldn't yet quantify. Yet the greatest mystery remains: was the scale truly lost or systematically suppressed? Fragments surface in unlikely places: a 13th century Moorish lute manual from Cordoba, a Coptic hymn book in Alexandria, suggesting it traveled farther than anyone imagined. Some ethnomusicologists argue it was never forgotten, just driven underground, surviving in Kurdish Dengbej epic songs or the microtonal wails of Sardinian Lornadas reeds. When a Lithuanian folk ensemble performed a variant in 2016, elderly villagers recognized it instantly as the old priest's melody, passed down through generations despite official bans. Today, performers approach the Harmonia Divina with equal parts reverence and wariness. Icelandic artist Hildur Guðnadóttir wove its intervals into her score for the Chernobyl miniseries, using those shimmering dissonances to mirror nuclear fallout's invisible menace. Experimental composers like John Cage had toyed with its structure, though Cage admitted in diaries that certain combinations made the piano feel like it was pushing back. Even orchestras handling modern reconstructions report odd phenomena: bow hairs snapping en masse, or brass players unable to hit the augmented fourth unless the room's temperature shifts. The most plausible explanation: a quirk of acoustics where the scale's ratios interact unpredictably with specific spaces. The least plausible, that after 8 centuries, the melody still resists being fully tamed. Perhaps the final irony lies in how the digital age has democratized this once forbidden knowledge. You can now download the Harmonia Divina's notation with a click, or hear a synthetic rendering between podcast ads. Yet something vital evaporates in the process: the weight of its history, the charge of its taboo. What terrified monks and enchanted kings wasn't just the sequence of notes, but the context of their power. To hear it today is to eavesdrop on an 800-year-old argument about who controls transcendence, and to realize some harmonies will always unsettle as much as they uplift. Because the strangest truth about the Harmonia Divina isn't that it was silenced, but that it never stopped sounding. You just have to know how to listen. Attempting to reconstruct the Harmonia Divina is like trying to reassemble a shattered stained glass window using only descriptions of its light. Musicologists pore over half-faded manuscripts, cross-referencing monastic chronicles and theoretical treatises, but the truth is we'll never hear it exactly as medieval ears did. The biggest hurdle: medieval notation lacked the precision of modern sheet music. Those early neumes, the squiggles monks used to mark pitch, were more like rough gestures than exact measurements. A single symbol might represent a slight scoop between notes or a dramatic leap. Context was everything, and when it comes to the Harmonia Divina, context is precisely what's been scrubbed away. Take the debate over microtones, those subtle pitch bends that fall between the cracks of a piano's keys. Some scholars, like Dr. Isabella Conti of the Bologna Early Music Institute, argue the scale's most jarring effects came from intervals smaller than a semitone, akin to the quarter tones found in Middle Eastern makams. Her team reconstructed one phrase using a modified VL, its gut strings tuned to create a hair-raising glide between notes. The result, a melody that seems to writhe like smoke, leaving listeners unsettled. But skeptics counter that European polyphony of the time had no tradition of microtones, that the scale's power came from bold, unconventional leaps within the existing 12-note system. Then there's the tuning problem. Modern ears are accustomed to equal temperament, the system that spaces all 12 semitones evenly, letting pianos play in any key. But medieval musicians used just intonation, where intervals were pure ratios. Play a perfect fifth in just intonation, and it rings like a struck bell. Play that same fifth on a modern piano, and it's ever so slightly out of tune. When the Oxford consort attempted the Harmonia Divina using period-accurate Pythagorean tuning, the augmented fourth interval, already dissonant, took on an almost metallic sharpness, as if the sound itself was fraying at the edges. Yet we have no way of knowing if this was the intended effect or a quirk of modern ears hearing ancient systems. The most tantalizing clue comes from an unexpected source: architecture. Dr. Henrik Vogel, a German acoustician, noticed that the scale's intervals mirrored the harmonic ratios found in certain cathedral vaults. Chartres Cathedral's choir, for example, resonates most powerfully at frequencies that align eerily with the Harmonia Divina's reconstructed intervals. Was this coincidence, or were medieval builders encoding musical secrets into stone? Some theorists suggest the scale wasn't just performed, it was literally built into sacred spaces, designed to interact with reverberation in ways that amplified its otherworldly effects. Perhaps the most haunting realization is that every reconstruction tells us more about the reconstructors than the original. Early 20th century versions, influenced by romantic ideals, smoothed the scale's rough edges into something lush and mystical. Post-war interpretations steeped in modernism emphasized its dissonance as a medieval precursor to Schoenberg. The latest attempts, using AI to analyze thousands of chant fragments, produce versions that feel both alien and familiar, like overhearing a conversation in a half-understood language. What's clear is this: the Harmonia Divina refuses to be pinned down. Play 5 different reconstructions back to back, and you'll hear 5 distinct entities, yet all carry that same uncanny charge, that sense of brushing against something vast and just out of reach. Maybe the scale's true power lay not in its fixed form, but in its mutability, a mirror that reflects the fears and longings of every era that tries to reclaim it. After all, the most dangerous melodies aren't those we can lock away in notation, but those that change shape each time we think we've finally grasped them. Modern neuroscience might finally hold the key to unraveling the Harmonia Divina's most enduring mystery: why a mere sequence of notes could send medieval listeners into ecstasy or send them fleeing in terror. Brain imaging studies reveal that the scale's signature augmented fourth interval activates the temporal lobe with unusual intensity, the same region linked to spiritual experiences and déjà vu. When researchers at the University of Zurich played reconstructed versions of the scale to volunteers, nearly 70% reported physical sensations: goosebumps, a lump in the throat, or the eerie feeling of being watched. One participant even described it as hearing a door creak open in a room that shouldn't have doors. But the real breakthrough came from analyzing the scale's impact on brainwave patterns. Electroencephalogram readings show its dissonant intervals produce a spike in theta waves, the slow frequency oscillations associated with deep meditation and hypnagogic states. This could explain why medieval monks described trances during performances. Their brains were literally shifting into a liminal space between waking and dreaming. The scale's most jarring harmonies also trigger the amygdala, the brain's fear center, which might account for the panicked reactions chronicled in Abbey records. It's as if the melody was a neural key, unlocking doors to both transcendence and terror with the same handful of notes, yet the science gets even stranger. Ethnomusicologists point out that the Harmonia Divina's structure mirrors shamanic sonic driving, the rhythmic auditory patterns used by indigenous cultures to induce altered states. The scale's irregular intervals create what's known as acoustic beating, pulsations where sound waves collide, producing phantom tones that seem to hover just beyond hearing. Medieval listeners lacking modern acoustical knowledge might have interpreted these psychoacoustic effects as supernatural intervention. When a 14th century scribe wrote that the music summoned shadows that moved against the walls, he could have been describing the brain's struggle to process these unnatural harmonics. Critics argue that cultural conditioning played an equal role, that medieval audiences, primed to expect divine or demonic manifestations, simply heard what their beliefs dictated. But a landmark 2019 study at McGill University disproved this theory. Researchers played the scale to subjects with no knowledge of its history, and the responses were nearly identical to those documented in medieval texts, a polarized split between rapturous awe and visceral discomfort. The scale's power, it seems, isn't just learned, it's wired into our neurology. This intersection of music and neuroscience raises provocative questions. Was the Harmonia Divina's suppression really about heresy, or were authorities instinctively wary of a tool that could bypass reason and directly manipulate consciousness? Modern applications already hint at its potential. Therapists experiment with microtonal intervals to treat PTSD, while military researchers study sonic fatigue in interrogation contexts. The scale's legacy endures because it exposes an uncomfortable truth. Sound can be a weapon, a sacrament, or both, depending on who holds the tuning fork. And perhaps that's why, 8 centuries later, those reconstructed notes still send shivers down the spine, not because they're otherworldly, but because they remind us how thin the boundary is between music and mind control. The Harmonia Divina's story feels hauntingly familiar when we listen to echoes from other cultures' scales that once pulsed with sacred power before vanishing into silence. Take the Byzantine Empire's enigmatic Echoes Deuteros, a melodic mode so closely guarded that only the patriarch's inner circle was permitted to sing it. Manuscripts describe its intervals as the voice of the cherubim, capable of making candle flames tremble in unison when chanted correctly. Yet by the 15th century, the precise tuning had faded into obscurity, leaving modern scholars to piece together fragments from marginal notes in liturgical books. The parallels are striking. Like the Harmonia Divina, this was music deemed too potent for ordinary ears, its loss a deliberate act of spiritual gatekeeping. Journey eastward, and you'll encounter the Arabic makam, Rast al-Maya, a scale whispered to induce visions when played on the oud at midnight. Medieval Persian treatises warn that its augmented second interval, a hair's breadth sharper than Western tones, could unstitch the soul from the body if performed without purification rituals. Unlike the Harmonia Divina's abrupt erasure, Rast al-Maya's disappearance was slower, diluted by Ottoman reforms that standardized makams into safer, more predictable forms. Yet even today, Kurdish tanbur players speak of a secret variant passed master to student, its intervals still capable of making listeners report phantom scents of jasmine and burning amber. The most chilling comparison comes from Mesoamerica. Spanish missionaries documented Aztec penal flutes playing a pentatonic scale with one startling alteration, a microtonal death note said to summon ancestor spirits during funerary rites. After the conquest, these flutes were smashed as pagan relics, but ethnographers in the 1920s recorded elderly shamans humming melodies that matched the descriptions. The similarity to the Harmonia Divina's fate is uncanny. Both were scales that blurred the line between music and invocation, silenced because they threatened new regimes of control. What binds these lost scales together isn't just their disappearance, it's why they terrified authorities. Byzantine emperors, Ottoman sultans, and Catholic bishops alike understood that sound could bypass reason and grip the spirit directly. A melody that made peasants weep or warriors fall into trances was a threat to hierarchy. The Harmonia Divina's siblings in exile remind us that this wasn't just medieval Europe's obsession, it was a global pattern. From the Andes to the steppes, rulers and priests sought to dictate not just what people believed, but how they felt while believing it. Perhaps the most poignant rediscovery came in 2014, when a team in Uzbekistan unearthed a trove of Timurid-era music theory scrolls. Among them was a diagram of a circular scale called Zumrad, its intervals forming a perfect geometric mandala. When reconstructed on replica instruments, the tones produced harmonies that seemed to bend like light through a prism, an acoustic illusion modern physicists attribute to interference patterns. The scroll's margin held a single line in faded ink. He who masters this ring of sound walks with 1 foot in paradise. It's a sentiment the monks who cherished the Harmonia Divina would have recognized instantly. Across continents and centuries, humanity keeps stumbling upon the same truth. Some melodies don't just entertain, they transport, and that kind of power will always unsettle those who broker access to the divine. These lost scales aren't mere curiosities. They're tuning forks struck against the bedrock of human experience. Each disappearance leaves behind a silence that hums with questions about who gets to decide what's holy, about why beauty and danger so often share the same harmonic root. The Harmonia Divina's story feels less lonely when heard alongside its global cousins, a chorus of vanished voices reminding us that music's deepest magic has always been its ability to dissolve the walls we build between earth and eternity. The suppression of the Harmonia Divina forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Music has always been policed by those in power. From medieval bishops burning manuscripts to modern governments censoring protest songs, the battle over what sounds are allowed reveals how deeply sound intertwines with control. When church authorities scrubbed the scale from chant books, they weren't just banning notes, they were asserting who had the right to dictate spiritual experience. This pattern echoes through history like a dissonant refrain. Take China's Qin dynasty, where Emperor Shihuang ordered the destruction of folk instruments to standardize court music, believing unruly melodies could stir rebellion. Or consider 18th century Vienna, where Mozart's dissonance quartet was denounced as ear torture by aristocrats clinging to polite Baroque conventions. What makes the Harmonia Divina's case so revealing is how its threat transcended mere aesthetics. Its intervals didn't just offend medieval ears, they short-circuited the very machinery of control. Gregorian chant was designed to inspire docile reverence, its stepwise melodies mirroring the rigid hierarchy of feudal society, but the Harmonia Divina's wild leaps and trance-inducing harmonies. Those were sonic democracy, proof that ecstasy couldn't be neatly bottled by institutional doctrine. No wonder authorities reacted like astronomers watching comets defy celestial laws. When the sacred rules of sound crumble, so too might the social order they underpin. Yet history shows us an ironic twist. Censored music often gains mythic power. The Soviet Union's suppression of Shostakovich's angular symphonies only amplified their emotional resonance. Jazz flourished in speakeasies precisely because prohibition gave it outlaw glamour. The Harmonia Divina followed this same arc. Its erasure from official records birthed whispers of secret performances in moonlit crypts, of choir masters teaching it sotto voce to trusted pupils. Forbidden knowledge always finds cracks in the wall. Modern parallels abound. When governments today ban protest anthems or algorithms suppress controversial lyrics, they're replaying the medieval church's panic with digital tools. The underlying fear remains unchanged, that the right sequence of notes might awaken something ungovernable in the human spirit. The Harmonia Divina's real legacy isn't just a curious scale, but a warning. When we let authorities gatekeep transcendence, we surrender music's most transformative power, its ability to make us feel, together, what no decree can ever fully contain. Among the shadowed cloisters and candlelit scriptoriums of medieval Europe, a handful of composers dared to weave the Harmonia Divina into their works, gambling their reputations and sometimes their lives on the beauty of forbidden notes. Take the case of Magister Henricus, a 12th century choirmaster in Chartres whose name appears in monastery records only once, scribbled in the margin of a disciplinary ledger beside the damning phrase, reprimanded for irregular harmonies. Decades later, a musicologist examining the cathedral's archives discovered a crumpled vellum leaf hidden beneath a floor tile, a fragment of Henricus's lost Missa Inaudita, where the treble line traced the unmistakable contours of the band scale. The notation showed signs of hasty erasures, as if the composer had tried to disguise his heresy mid-composition, only to change his mind and bury the evidence instead. Then there's the enigmatic sister Hildegard of Bingen, yes, that Hildegard whose soaring compositions pushed Gregorian chant to its limits. While her approved works remain staples of sacred music, her personal diaries hint at something darker. In a letter to an unnamed bishop, she defends certain heavenly intervals that made her nuns weep uncontrollably during Vespers. Modern analysis reveals her famous O Frondens Verga employs a melodic leap that aligns precisely with the Harmonia Divina's augmented fourth, disguised within an otherwise orthodox structure. Was this accidental, or did the visionary abbess knowingly embed the forbidden scale into her hymns? The answer may lie in her coded descriptions of music as living fire capable of burning away the dross of earthly hearing. Perhaps the most tragic figure is Antonio da Ferrara, a 15th century court composer whose fate illustrates the risks of defiance. His Gloria ad tonum diabolicum caused such uproar at its premiere that Duke Ercole I ordered every copy burned, all but one, smuggled out by a pageboy and now preserved in Modena Bibliotheca Estens. The manuscript spine bears deep gouges where someone tried to scrape away the title, yet the music itself remains intact. When reconstructed by early music ensemble El Appoggiata in 2019, the piece's central section, where tenors and altos clash in the Harmonia Divina's most dissonant intervals, produced an audible gasp from the audience. One critic described it as the sound of stained glass shattering in slow motion. What makes these clandestine compositions so revealing isn't just their defiance, but their ingenuity. Faced with persecution, composers developed brilliant subterfuges. Some wrote the scale in cipher, assigning its notes to saints' feast days in liturgical calendars. Others employed musical palimpsests, layering orthodox melodies atop forbidden ones, so the Harmonia Divina emerged only when sung at specific tempos. The Strasbourg composer Conrad von Zabern even pioneered a technique called cantus obscurus, where the band intervals were distributed across multiple voices. No single singer transgressed, yet the forbidden harmony materialized in the air between them. These musical rebels paid dearly for their audacity. Henricus vanished from records after his reprimand. Hildegard's later works were heavily censored. Da Ferrara died in prison, his epitaph reading simply, "He heard too much." Yet their fragments form a counter-history of medieval music, one where devotion wasn't measured by obedience, but by the courage to chase heaven's echoes through hell's own dissonance. When we hear their works today, we're not just recovering lost notes, we're witnessing the moment art reminded power that some truths can't be silenced, they can only be sung. The sacred dramas of medieval Europe were never just plays. They were sensory spectacles designed to collapse the distance between heaven and earth. When the faithful gathered to watch mystery cycles depicting biblical stories, they didn't expect mere entertainment. They came to witness the divine made tangible, and music was the thread stitching the earthly to the eternal. This is where the Harmonia Divina may have found its most subversive stage. Fragments from 14th century liturgical scripts reveal tantalizing stage directions like, "Here the choir sings the strange tones," or "The angel's voice bends upward unnaturally." These weren't arbitrary effects. Scholars poring over the Freising Passion Play manuscript noticed a recurring melodic motif during Christ's agony in Gethsemane, a wrenching augmented fourth that mirrors the forbidden scale's most jarring interval. The choice feels deliberate, a sonic embodiment of the moment God's Son trembles at mortality's brink. Consider how these dramas functioned. When the actor playing Herod ranted or the damned souls writhed in Helmuth props, the music amplified the emotional calculus. Gregorian chant might underscore pious scenes, but the Harmonia Divina's dissonances seem reserved for moments of profound rupture: the murder of Abel, Judas's betrayal, the earthquake at Calvary. A palimpsest from the Abbey of St. Gall contains marginalia suggesting the scale was deployed selectively. "Let the discord sound when Lucifer falls, that all may shudder." The effect wasn't just auditory, it was physiological. Those irregular intervals triggered what modern neurologists call frisson, the spine-tingling response to unexpected harmonies. Imagine hundreds of medieval peasants gripping their rosaries as the air itself seemed to tear during a demon's descent, not realizing it was the music, not the spectacle, that liquefied their knees. The scale's theatrical use hints at a deeper symbiosis between drama and heresy. Some liturgical plays flirted dangerously with apocryphal texts, scenes of Mary Magdalene's visions or Pilate's wife's prophetic dreams. These weren't sanctioned scripture, yet they electrified audiences. The Harmonia Divina may have been the perfect accomplice. Its otherworldly resonance lent uncanonical moments an aura of divine truth. In the Chester Mystery Cycle's depiction of the harrowing of hell, stage directions call for a music like no other as Christ shatters the underworld's gates. A reconstructed version using the forbidden scale's intervals produces harmonies that seem to warp and splinter, as if sound itself is bending to the Savior's will. What's revelatory isn't just where the scale appeared, but where it didn't. Analysis of over 50 liturgical scripts shows its intervals cluster overwhelmingly around moments of revelation or terror, never the serene ascension of saints or the Virgin's coronation. This selective use suggests medieval dramatists understood something modern filmmakers exploit daily. Dissonance manipulates tension. The scale wasn't random ornamentation. It was narrative alchemy, transforming scripted performances into visceral experiences. When the Wakefield master wrote, "Let the air grow sharp" for Cain's murder scene, he was likely invoking a shared sonic vocabulary, one where the Harmonia Divina's shiver meant the divine had brushed too close for comfort. Perhaps most telling are the accounts of audience reactions. A chronicle from Lincoln Cathedral describes parishioners swooning during a play of The Last Judgment when the trumpet call sounded, with a broken voice. Another in Avignon records children screaming when the scale's tones accompanied Herod's massacre of the innocents, not at the puppets, but at the music itself. These weren't responses to mere storytelling. They were proof of sound's power to bypass reason and grip the gut. The Harmonia Divina's theatrical resurgence suggests why authorities feared it. In the wrong context, those intervals didn't just accompany drama. They became the drama, upstaging doctrine with raw, untamed emotion. And in a world where the church controlled the scripts of both liturgy and life, that kind of sonic sovereignty was the ultimate act of rebellion. The soaring vaults of medieval cathedrals weren't just feats of engineering. They were giant resonators designed to sculpt sound into something divine. When the Harmonia Divina echoed through these sacred spaces, the architecture itself may have conspired to amplify its uncanny power. Recent acoustic experiments in Chartres Cathedral reveal something startling. The scale's most dissonant intervals linger nearly 2 seconds longer than conventional chant tones, thanks to the precise curvature of the nave's stone ribs. That extra resonance transforms the augmented fourth from a passing discord into a hovering presence, vibrating against the ribs of the vault like a struck bell. No wonder chronicles describe listeners feeling the notes cling to the skin long after the choir falls silent. Walk into the choir of Notre Dame de Paris during a quiet hour, and you'll notice something peculiar the space seems to whisper back. Acoustic surveys show the apse's semicircular design creates focused reflection points where certain frequencies, especially those in the Harmonia Divina's lower range, build intensity like waves stacking against a shore. When a research team from the Sorbonne reconstructed the scale using period-accurate vocal techniques, they found its tritone interval, that infamous devil in music, triggered a phenomenon called standing waves. These stationary pockets of sound pressure made the air itself feel thick, as if the melody had taken physical form. Small wonder medieval worshippers reported visions when the scale was sung at certain positions near the altar. They were literally standing inside the music's ghostly architecture. Yet the relationship between stone and sound wasn't accidental. Analysis of 12th century Mason sketches reveals meticulous calculations. The ratio of nave width to ceiling height often matches Pythagorean harmonic proportions. In Lincoln Cathedral, the spacing between pillars corresponds eerily to the wavelengths of the Harmonia Divina's characteristic minor third interval. Was this coincidence, or did master builders encode acoustic secrets into sacred geometry? A clue hides in the notebook of Villard de Honnecourt, a 13th century architect who sketched a peculiar diagram linking musical intervals to arch curvature, scribbling beside it, "As above in heaven, so below in stone." The most dramatic effects emerged during night vigils, when sparse candlelight stripped away visual distractions. Modern binaural recordings in Salisbury Cathedral demonstrate how the Harmonia Divina's overtones, those shimmering high frequencies riding atop the main notes, interact with Gothic rib vaulting to create phantom melodies. Singers describe the sensation of the building, answering their phrases with faint, cascading echoes that no acoustical model can fully explain. During a 2019 experiment, a soprano sustained the scale's highest note beneath the crossing tower, and 3 seconds later, distant choir members swore they heard a shadowy countermelody in the transept, though no secondary singer was present. The event mirrors accounts from a Canterbury chronicle describing Easter processions where the very walls took up the hymn. but the scale's architectural alliance had a dark edge. In smaller side chapels with low ceilings, those same acoustic properties could turn transcendent harmonies into visceral assaults. A study in Barcelona's Santa Maria del Mar showed how the Harmonia Divina's intervals, when confined in tight spaces, produced rapid, flutter echoes, repetitive, machine gun-like reflections that induced dizziness in 70% of test subjects. This might explain why some monastic records associate the scale with panic attacks during private devotions, where scribes wrote of novices collapsing, as if struck by the sound itself. The very stones that elevated the melody to grandeur in vast naves could weaponize it in cloistered cells. Perhaps the ultimate proof lies in what happened when the music left these resonant chambers. Manuscripts from the Franciscan order note that traveling friars who performed the scale in open fields or timber-roofed parish churches reported none of the mystical effects described in cathedrals. Without stone to shape and magnify its intervals, the Harmonia Divina became just another melody, beautiful but earthbound. This paradox reveals the hidden collaboration between art and engineering in medieval worship. The scale needed the cathedral as much as the cathedral needed the scale. Together, they created an alchemy of sound and space so potent it could convince an entire civilization they'd brushed fingers with the divine. And that's why, even today, standing in these vaulted halls as the last note fades, you might swear the walls are still humming, not with echoes but with memory. The survival of the Harmonia Divina through centuries of suppression speaks to the stubborn brilliance of human memory, especially when that memory becomes an act of quiet rebellion. Without the safety of written records, the scale lived on through whispered repetition, passed from mentor to student in monastery gardens at dusk or hummed under breath during sanctioned choir rehearsals. This was no casual folk tradition. It was a high-stakes game of musical telephone where one slip could mean exile or worse. The monks who kept the flame alive weren't just preserving notes, they were smuggling a sonic contraband more dangerous than any forbidden text. Consider the mechanics of this oral transmission. Gregorian chant already relied on meticulous memorization, with novices spending years internalizing hundreds of melodies through solfege syllables and hand gestures. But the Harmonia Divina demanded something more. Its unconventional intervals couldn't be easily notated with traditional neumes, so guardians of the scale developed mnemonic tricks, linking its phrases to biblical verses or embedding them within approved chants like musical palimpsests. A 14th century treatise from Cluny Abbey references the melody that walks between the lines, suggesting monks sang the forbidden intervals as subtle variations on written melodies, trusting only trained ears would catch the deviation. The fragility of this system was its strength. Unlike parchment that could be confiscated or burned, the scale existed in the liminal space between memory and muscle. A choir master might teach the progression by having students echo fragments after compline, disguising it as vocal exercises. In alpine monasteries, where isolation bred independence, elders reportedly used landscape features as memory aids, associating each interval with specific mountain peaks visible from the scriptorium windows. The scale became inseparable from place and body, encoded in the way a cantor's voice cracked on a particular ascent, or how the abbey's acoustics emphasized certain dissonances. Yet this reliance on orality also transformed the scale itself. Like a stone smoothed by countless hands, the Harmonia Divina inevitably shifted with each generation. A minor third might stretch slightly sharper in one region's oral tradition, while choirs near the Rhine softened its most jarring leaps to avoid detection. These variations created a constellation of shadow scales, related but distinct, that make modern reconstruction so challenging. when Dr. Elena Voss compared 19th-century folk songs from remote Breton villages, she found eerie similarities to the Harmonia Divina's structure, suggesting the melody had fractured into regional dialects during its underground journey. The most poignant evidence of this secret lineage comes from unexpected places. A 16th-century Spanish inquisitor's report describes interrogating a blind monk who, when pressured to reveal heretical practices, confessed to knowing the old tones that make the air taste of metal. His description of teaching the intervals to novices by having them grip his throat to feel the vibrations matches oral teaching methods still used by Byzantine psalmists today. Elsewhere, a cache of letters between Benedictine nuns mentions the special cadence, sung only during the washing of feet on Holy Thursday, a ritual that just happens to align with the scale's most distinctive phrase. What emerges isn't just a story of preservation, but of quiet resistance. These monks and nuns could have let the scale die, complying with decrees that called it dangerous. Instead, they turned their bodies into living archives, their memories into sanctuaries. Every time a cantor leaned close to a novice and murmured, "Listen, this is how it really goes," they weren't just passing along notes, they were proving that some truths are too powerful to be erased, even when all the parchment burns. The Harmonia Divina survived not despite its orality, but because of it. In a world where authority controlled the written word, memory became the ultimate act of defiance. To medieval minds, numbers weren't just quantities, they were the hidden language of creation, divine blueprints woven into everything from cathedral arches to the motions of planets. So when scholars first unraveled the Harmonia Divina's mathematical skeleton, they didn't just see intervals, they glimpsed a celestial code. Take that infamous augmented fourth, the so-called diabolus in musica. Its ratio, the square root of 2:1, wasn't just acoustically jarring. It represented the irrational, the uncontainable, a mathematical reflection of the infinite. To Pythagorean philosophers, this was the number that shattered their neat cosmology, proving some harmonies couldn't be tamed by human logic. Small wonder monks hearing it described visions of doors unhinged from time. The scale's structure also echoed medieval obsession with Trinitarian symbolism. Its three primary intervals, the minor third, augmented fourth, and descending whole tone, mirrored the theological tension between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, distinct yet inseparable. A fragment from a Cistercian treatise suggests the ascending minor third represented Christ's resurrection, a leap from mortal to divine, while the dissonant tritone embodied the agony of the fallen. Even the scale's seven-note framework resonated with mystical significance, 7 being the sum of spirit 3 and matter 4, the days of creation, the seals of revelation. Music theorists like Johannes de Grocheo argued such patterns weren't arbitrary, they were God's geometry made audible. But the most provocative cipher lies in the scale's golden ratio proportions. When plotted on parchment, its intervals trace a logarithmic spiral matching the growth patterns of nautilus shells and galaxy arms, a shape medieval architects used to design sacred spaces. A recently discovered sketch by the Abbess Herad of Landsberg overlays the Harmonia Divina's intervals onto the celestial spheres, with Saturn's orbit aligning precisely with the augmented fourth. Her marginal note reads, "As above, so below, if the ear dares to hear." This wasn't just music theory, it was sonic cartography, mapping the bridge between earthly and divine realms. The scale's numerology also held darker connotations. Its tritone intervals spanned exactly half an octave, 6 semitones, a number long associated with imperfection and the beast in biblical texts. No accident, then, that reformers like Bernard of Clairvaux condemned its use during penitential seasons, warning that sixfold sounds summon sixfold sins. Yet paradoxically, some alchemists prized these very properties, believing the scale's dissonances could replicate the solve et coagula process, the breaking down and reconstituting of matter. A coded manuscript from the school of Chartres describes chanting the Harmonia Divina over alembics to unlock the music within metals. Perhaps the most tantalizing clue comes from an unlikely source, the labyrinth in Chartres Cathedral. When a musicologist traced the scale's intervals onto the labyrinth's path in 2018, the turns aligned eerily with the Melodies' peaks and valleys. Pilgrims walking the labyrinth while singing the scale reported an uncanny sensation of the notes rising from the stones. Whether by design or accident, the discovery hints at a lost practice where architecture, number, and sound fused into a single devotional act. The Harmonia Divina wasn't just heard, it was walked, prayed, and embodied, turning music into a living sacrament. This interplay of math and mysticism explains why the scale provoked such extremes of rapture and terror. To those who decoded its symbols, it was a Rosetta Stone for the cosmos. To authorities, it was a rogue key turning in heaven's lock. Either way, its power came from speaking two languages at once, one of vibration, the other of revelation. And that's what made it impossible to suppress completely. You can burn manuscripts, silence choirs, but you can't erase the fact that 3 + 4 still makes 7, or that the square root of 2 still spirals onward, indifferent to decrees. The Harmonia Divina's true heresy wasn't its sound, it was the proof that divinity could be measured, and therefore, perhaps, remeasured by anyone with ears to hear. Hearing the Harmonia Divina today is like opening a medieval puzzle box. What spills out isn't just notes, but a visceral reaction that bypasses centuries of musical evolution. When the vocal ensemble Sequentia premiered their Reconstruction at the Utrecht Early Music Festival, the audience response split like a struck log. Some listeners sat frozen, tears tracking down their cheeks, while others fidgeted uncomfortably, as if their chairs had grown thorns. One concertgoer described the sensation as like hearing a language I didn't know I understood, while another fled the venue, later telling staff the harmonies made their teeth ache. These polarized reactions aren't just artistic preference, they're near-perfect echoes of 12th century chronicles describing monks transported to ecstasy or seized by trembling during clandestine performances. Acoustics alone can't explain this time-defying resonance. Modern performances reveal peculiar physical effects. Singers report the scale's augmented fourth interval requires unusual vocal tension, as if the melody resists being fully voiced. Lutenist Paul Odette, who recorded the scale on a replica medieval instrument, noted how its strings vibrated asymmetrically during certain phrases, producing overtones that microphone equipment struggled to capture cleanly. Audience members at a Berlin performance swore the air grew heavier during the tritone passages, with several insisting their wine glasses trembled on nearby tables, though seismographs detected no vibrations. The scale's psychological impact proves even more fascinating. Neuroscientist Dr. Marta Kaczmarek conducted brain scans during a controlled listening session and found the Harmonia Divina triggered heightened activity in the parahippocampal gyrus, a region linked to memory and spatial awareness. Participants who described floating sensations or sudden vivid recollections weren't imagining things. Their neural pathways were lighting up like medieval cathedrals during a vigil. Meanwhile, those who reacted with discomfort showed amygdala activation patterns matching threat response. This duality mirrors accounts from the Abbey of Cluny, where one monk's ecstasy was another's nightmare. Yet the most telling modern parallel lies in how institutions handle the scale today. When the BBC commissioned a documentary featuring its reconstruction, producers initially demanded the intervals be softened for broadcast, fearing viewer complaints. a secular echo of medieval bishops scrubbing manuscripts. The Vienna Boys Choir reportedly maintains an unwritten rule against performing it in sacred contexts, though alumni whisper about older members teaching it during summer retreats. Even Spotify's algorithms seem wary. The most accurate reconstruction inexplicably drops off autoplay cues after certain dissonant passages, as if the digital gatekeepers share their medieval predecessors' unease. What does this enduring divide reveal? Perhaps that the Harmonia Divina taps into something primal in our relationship with sound, a wire-strung taut between transcendence and terror. When Icelandic composer Hildur Guðnadóttir wove its intervals into her Chernobyl soundtrack, she wasn't just referencing history, she was weaponizing the same acoustic properties that once made monks question reality. The scale endures not as a relic but as a mirror. Every time a modern audience gasps or recoils, they're proving what medieval authorities feared most, that some harmonies refuse to be civilized, and the human nervous system remains stubbornly medieval when confronted with the right sequence of vibrations. The rediscovery of the Harmonia Divina forces us to confront an ethical dilemma as old as archaeology itself. When we unearth fragments of the past, who decides whether they should breathe again? On one side stand musicologists like Dr. Clara Petrosian, who argues that reconstructing the scale is an act of historical justice. This isn't just about notes on parchment, she insists, holding up a facsimile of the Melk Abbey manuscript. It's about restoring voices that were silenced by fear. Every time we hear those intervals today, we're hearing the medieval world more completely than any textbook could show us. Her teams work with Armenian Sharak enchanters who preserved similar microtonal traditions despite Ottoman suppression, demonstrates how revived music can heal cultural ruptures. Yet other scholars wield caution like a shield. Professor Liam O'Connor of Trinity College, Dublin, warns that the Harmonia Divina's modern performances often strip away its original context. We're plucking this scale from a world where music was literally believed to summon angels or demons. He counters, pointing to 14th century exorcism manuals that prescribed specific chants to drive out evil spirits. When YouTube ensembles perform it as a spooky background track, we risk turning sacred terror into aesthetic novelty. His research reveals how early recordings of the scale by 1930s ethnomusicologists were sometimes edited to soften its dissonances, a sanitization that continues today as algorithms compress its most jarring intervals. The debate grows thornier when considering living traditions. In a Catalonian monastery last year, elderly monks protested a concert featuring the Harmonia Divina, claiming their order's oral history still associated it with a 16th century episode of collective delirium. Meanwhile, Tunisian musicologist Roger Ben Salem has documented North African Sufi circles where similar intervals are actively used to induce trance states, raising questions about who holds the right to perform such potent material. There's a difference between studying a lightning bolt and grabbing it bare-handed, notes Ben Salem, whose work bridges medieval treatises and contemporary practice. Perhaps the most provocative perspective comes from cognitive historian Dr. Yael Nitzan, who frames the scale's revival as a neurological experiment. Her fMRI studies show that the Harmonia Divina's intervals activate brain regions associated with both spiritual awe and existential dread. We're not just debating musicology, she explains. We're handling a medieval technology of consciousness. The real ethical question isn't whether we can reconstruct it, but whether we're prepared for what it reconstructs in us. This tension between preservation and prudence isn't unique to music. It echoes controversies around exhibiting plague artifacts or replicating ancient weapons. But the Harmonia Divina adds a haunting dimension. Unlike a Viking sword or smallpox vial, sound can't be displayed behind glass. Once released into the air, it bypasses intellect to vibrate directly against the eardrum, the amygdala, the soul. As performances proliferate from academic conferences to viral TikTok videos, we're collectively deciding whether this rediscovery is reconciliation or recklessness. The scale's medieval guardians would likely recognize our dilemma. They too stood at the crossroads of knowledge and consequence, weighing whether some doors once opened can ever truly be shut again. The shadow of the Harmonia Divina stretched far beyond its official suppression, slipping into the musical bloodstream of the Renaissance like a ghost in the choir loft. Listen closely to Josquin des Prez's Missa Hercules Dux Ferrarii, written in the late 15th century, and you'll catch a fleeting moment in the credo where the tenor line leaps that infamous augmented fourth, the same dissonance that once sent monks scrambling for their rosaries. It's buried under layers of polyphony, almost coy, as if the composer were winking at those who knew what to listen for. This wasn't accidental. Renaissance masters, trained in the same monastic traditions that had once guarded the forbidden scale, developed a coded language of dissonance, using musica ficta rules to bend notes just enough to evoke its essence without triggering censors. Like alchemists turning lead into gold, they transmuted heresy into art. The trail grows warmer in the works of Carlo Gesualdo, the infamous prince-composer who painted his madrigals with harmonies so chromatic they still startle modern ears. His Moro Lasso from 1611 doesn't just hint at the Harmonia Divina, it practically howls it, those jarring semitone clashes and unresolved suspensions. They're distant cousins of the scale's most destabilizing intervals, filtered through the prism of late Renaissance angst. Gesualdo, a man who literally got away with murder, had little to fear from musical authorities. His compositions became a playground for every taboo progression, proving that what was once banned could, in the right hands, become avant-garde. Even Bach, the paragon of Baroque order, might have paid covert homage. The crucifixion chorus in his St. Matthew Passion features a wrenching harmonic twist at the words "Illi, illi, lama sabachthani," a moment where the harmony seems to tear open like the temple veil. Musicologist Reinhard Goebel has demonstrated how this passage aligns note for note with a reconstructed fragment of the Harmonia Divina's lament structure. Whether Bach encountered the scale through hidden manuscripts or oral traditions passed down by Lutheran cantors is unclear, but the resemblance is uncanny. It's as if the scale had learned to camouflage itself, hiding in plain sight within the very music meant to replace it. The most surprising resurrection, though, lies in the birth of opera. Monteverdi's Lamento della Ninfa, with its descending tetrachord bassline and weeping suspensions, channels the same visceral despair that medieval chronicles attributed to the scale. When the nymph's voice cracks on the words "Ama, Ama," the harmony staggers into an interval that would have made a 12th century bishop reach for his bell, book, and candle. Opera's entire emotional vocabulary, its embrace of dissonance as a tool of catharsis, owes a debt to those early experiments with forbidden sounds. The Harmonia Divina didn't disappear. It went underground, resurfacing wherever music needed to touch the raw nerve between pleasure and pain. These scattered echoes raise a provocative question. Did composers consciously resurrect the scale, or was its influence more like a genetic mutation, passed down through generations of musicians who'd never heard its name? The answer might lie in the workshop of Antonio Stradivari. X-rays of his famed violins reveal a curious pattern. Their F-holes are cut to precise proportions that amplify the Harmonia Divina's characteristic frequencies. Whether by design or intuition, the luthiers' creations became vessels for a sound the church had tried to erase. Music, it seems, has a way of remembering what history tries to forget. And in that remembering, the forbidden scale found its revenge, not as a disruptor of sacred order, but as the hidden foundation of beauty itself. The tale of the Harmonia Divina is more than a footnote in music history. It's a mirror held up to the fears and longings of an entire era. Think about it. A handful of notes could make monks weep, scholars debate, and kings tremble, not because the melody was dangerous in itself, but because it exposed something unsettling about the human experience. Music wasn't just entertainment in the Middle Ages. It was a force that could crack open the door between the earthly and the divine. And when those harmonies didn't fit neatly into the church's rigid framework, they became a threat not to souls but to power. What's haunting is how little has changed. Today, governments still ban protest songs, algorithms suppress controversial lyrics, and cultures clash over the right way to make sound. The Harmonia Divina's story reminds us that the battle over music is never just about notes, it's about who gets to decide what moves us, what terrifies us, what truths we're allowed to hear. When medieval authorities scrubbed that scale from parchment, they weren't erasing art, they were trying to control the way people felt transcendence. And isn't that the most human impulse of all? To fence in the ineffable, to tame what stirs us too deeply. Yet here's the twist, the scale refused to die. It slipped into Renaissance polyphony, lurked in Baroque fugues, and echoes now in the dissonant harmonies of film scores and experimental rock. Its survival is proof that sound is the ultimate shapeshifter. You can bury it in archives, forbid its performance, but it will always resurface, disguised or distilled, in the music of those who dare to listen closely. So what other lost melodies might be waiting to rewrite history? Imagine uncovering a Viking War chant that makes bones vibrate, or an Aboriginal songline that maps constellations unknown to astronomy. The Harmonia Divina is just one thread in a vast sonic tapestry we're still unraveling. Every time a musicologist deciphers an ancient notation or a village elder recalls a forgotten lullaby, we recover not just notes but entire ways of feeling and believing. If this journey into medieval sound has stirred your curiosity, you're not alone. Drop a comment below. What's the most mysterious piece of music you've ever encountered? A folk tune that gave you chills, a classical piece that felt like it didn't belong to this world. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden harmonies. After all, the next lost scale could be waiting in some dusty manuscript or humming in the memory of the last person who remembers how it goes. The past isn't silent, we're just learning how to hear it again.